So, Mark, I got a quick question for you. We're talking a little bit about the next relief package, and it seems to me that Republicans in the House and the Senate are looking a lot towards things like third quarter GDP data and the drop in the unemployment rate as sort of justification for going much smaller on a relief package than what I think a lot of people would expect or think that we need. And I look at that data, and that data is backwards looking. It's a look in the rear view mirror. What happened, a quarter ago in terms of economic activity? What happened last month with jobs? In your mind, is there data that policymakers would be better served at looking at in that it's more forward looking in terms of driving public policy? I mean, Bob wrote a column the other day where he talked about our health indicators are our economic indicators, and that looking at those should perhaps drive policy. But as an economist, and knowing what it takes to rev up an economy, I was wondering if there are specific data points that are more forward-looking than GDP and unemployment rate to sort of help drive policy.
Bob has a good point. I mean, in the current pandemic, I think what's going on with the virus goes a long way to saying what's going to happen to the economy. It's not hard to connect the dots between the infections, particularly hospitalizations, obviously, because if hospitals get overwhelmed, then local officials have no choice but to pull back their businesses, restaurants, bars, gyms, so restricting the number of people who can get together in public spaces. And people also self-quarantine, they're nervous. You can see it in the mobility data, this recent surge in infections and hospitalizations has caused people to kind of pull back on moving around, and that goes directly to economic activity. Those links are not quite as strong as they were, back in the summer when we had this kind of that second wave, and certainly not compared to when we shut down everything back in March and April. But those relationships still hold, and so that's a pretty good indicator. If you've got infections over 200K per day confirmed and over 100K in hospitalizations, and news stories of hospitals that are having trouble, with their ICU units, that is gives you a pretty good sense the economy is going to struggle, and that's what you see in the data. The most, I think the best data to be looking at, though, in the current context, real time, is probably the employment data. It's a little bit lagged, no doubt, but it is. We get the survey for December is being done next week, and we're going to get that data in the first week of January, right after New Year's. That gives you a pretty good sense of what's going on. I mean, there's obviously every data point, everything we look at has problems, particularly in the fog of a pandemic. But I think that's a pretty good data to look at. I personally look at a lot of other data, third-party data, non-government data. So, for example, we have a relationship with payroll processor ADP, and so I get a sense. That's 23 million records for 23 million employees, and that's updated every day, and I can see what's going on there. And the Fed looks at that data too. So they're looking at, it's not public data, but it's it's released once a month. But there's other data that is released that is very valuable that I look at. From Homebase, that's data on employment for smaller businesses. I look at data from this company called Cortera. Cortera tracks business-to-business spending real time, and it's very cool data, interesting data, and you can look at it by industry, by company size, by zip code if you want to, and you can take you can get I get a file whenever I think something is I need to look, and the company will provide that data, and I get a very clear look on and B2B spending in lots of industries, a very clear indication of what's going on B2C, business to consumer. And so, because like Walmart buys from its vendor, I see that data, and then it sells to consumers. So it's a very good kind of leading indicator. And so there's all kinds of data like that become more. Certainly, I didn't have that in the financial crisis a little over a decade ago, but now we do, and I find it quite valuable in trying to assess what's going on right now. But bottom line for policymakers, I don't think I'd be looking at GDP. That's quarterly. It's lagged. I would look at the straight up how many jobs are being created month to month, and what's happening with the unemployment rate and the underemployment rate. Folks that have been pushed out of the workforce.
So, Mark, the federal government is issuing massive amounts of debt to pay for these COVID relief packages and just normal operating expenses. The deficit was, top $3 trillion in the fiscal year that just finished. Um, and the debt held by the public is reaching 100% of GDP if it's not there already. Concord Coalition has taken the position that when this crisis is over, we need a plan to reduce our debt. But there are economists and policy experts that think the United States is special, that because our debt is denominated in US dollars, that we can just print more money to pay it off. When I was a student of economics, my professors taught me that this causes interest rates to rise, the value of the dollar to fall, and inflation to accelerate. But we've not seen any of that yet. Are these so-called new modern monetary theorists or MMTers, are they correct? Do they have the right prescription for our economy, or should we be worrying about debt and deficits?
No, they don't have it right. We should be worried about deficits and debt, just not right now. I do think we need to provide support, deficit finance, fiscal support to get to the other side of the pandemic and give us a nice jump start to get back to full employment. Because if we don't do that, then I think our economy will, as I mentioned earlier, go back into recession, and the cost to the government will be even greater. Our deficits and debt will be even larger. So it's kind of a Hobson's choice. There's no good choice, but the least bad choice from a fiscal perspective is to ante up, get us to the other side, bridge the economy over to the other side, get us going back to full employment as fast as possible. And then as you're approaching full employment, let's say that's 2-3 years from now, then obviously I'm applying a level of precision that may not be possible politically, but I'm an economist and I can do this on paper, at least in the model. You pivot and you say, okay, now we need to address our fiscal situation, and that will mean restraint on spending, and it will mean tax increases both. And you pivot and you do that. If you don't do that and you continue to deficit, in taxes remain low, no change in the tax code, it will just do exactly what your professor told you. The economy will get back to full employment, inflation will accelerate, interest rates will rise, and we will pay a price, significant price in terms of long-term economic growth. And so the appropriate policy would be to pivot and to address that. I will say one other thing, though. In all likelihood, to generate the political will necessary to address our long-term fiscal problems, let's say when we are approaching full employment, will probably require interest rates to rise. I don't think lawmakers can connect the dots in the minds of the electorate between deficits, debt, and what the economic implications are, unless interest rates are rising. I mean, Bob Rubin was able to do that in the 1990s. You could connect the dots. You remember the bond market vigilantes? Clinton said, "Oh, okay, I get it," and he was very cautious. He gave up on a big deficit finance fiscal package, and we saw the fruits of that. By the end of that decade, we were back. That's the last time we had a surplus in 2000 was, I believe, fiscal year 2000. The last year we had the surplus, but it took higher interest rates in the early 90s, mid 90s, for Bob Rubin, the Secretary of Treasury, to convince everybody, most importantly President Clinton, that we need fiscal restraint, and it paid off big. And so hopefully we're able to pull off a very similar kind of storyline down the road when we are back to full employment. But the MMT guys are they're as wrong as the supply side guys, right? I mean, you have to give them credit. It is an answer to supply side. Supply side, kind of Republicans saw that, I can cut taxes, that'll pay for itself. But don't worry, if it doesn't, we'll just cut spending. And the Democrats really didn't have a response to that until MMT. And MMT as well, we'll increase government spending. It'll pay for itself because of all the economic activity it generates. But don't worry, if it doesn't, we'll just raise taxes. So, I give them credit, and actually it serves a purpose, right? It kind of offsets the intellectual gendarmerie of the Republicans. So I kind of get it, but the reality is both are wrong, dead wrong.
related to a lot of what we're talking about here is the importance of interest rates. We've talked about how they're very low now, and they stayed low, as Chase mentioned, coming out of the Great Recession. And I think as if there's one phenomenon that has dominated the last 10 years or so in the fiscal policy debate, it is what's happening with interest rates, because most of us would have assumed much higher interest rates and that this level of debt would have piled on much more debt by this time. And CBO has, been aggressively ratcheting down appropriately, I think, their assumptions about where interest rates are going to be. So, but right now it seems that we're making a major gamble on interest rates staying, pretty low, not maybe where they are right now, but very, very low by historic rates, which if you play that out, allows the government to take on a heck of a lot more debt than we would have thought was prudent at any time before that. So I wanted to get your take on why interest rates have been so unusually low, and what might change to make them go higher. And again, I'm talking post-pandemic in that sense. Nobody's talking about paying for the emergency needs now or some stimulus needs coming out of it. But when we think about a post-pandemic economic growth policy, what might go wrong for that low interest rate scenario?
Yeah, I think I think it's fair to say that interest rates and inflation were lower than, surprisingly low in the recovery, the 10-year-long recovery and expansion coming out of the financial crisis. The biggest surprise to me as a macroeconomist in that expansion was how low inflation interest rates remained. I think it was three, there's a number of factors, but I'll mention three very quickly. First, I do think it took us a long time to get back to full employment. I mean, it was a very slow recovery. I mean, painfully slow, and partly because of the fiscal restraint that was inappropriately applied too early coming out of that period. And of course, it was also the result of the financial crisis. The fact that the financial system caved required a government bailout, and it took a long time for the financial system to get back up and running, repair itself, and start providing credit in a fulsome way. And so that hurt the economic recovery. So reason number one, we just, we didn't get back to full employment. Reason number two, I think there was a surfeit of global saving. I mean, the bond markets became much more globally oriented since the 1990s. In the 90s, it was primarily domestically focused, but by the 2010s, it was very globally oriented. So it was not only what was going on here in the United States, it's what's going on everywhere else in the world. And because Europe was flat on its back and Japan flat on its back, negative interest rates that put downward pressure onto long-term interest rates. And third, I do think technology and globalization came together and created competitive forces that depressed inflation. Businesses didn't have pricing power. They lost their competitive edge because they had to compete as technologies, upset their business models, and they had to compete against the Chinese that were coming on and so forth. And of course, China's entry also played a role in all of this. So I think it's a melange of things that surprise. I'll say this though, going forward, I think the biggest surprise will be, from a macroeconomic perspective, how high inflation and interest rates will be going forward. And the reason is that I do think the recovery here is going to be a lot faster than after the financial crisis. This economy is, I think it's going to be 3 years to get back to full employment, not 8 years to get back to full employment. And we can talk about why, but some obvious reasons. The financial system has remained, because of Fed actions, insulated from the chaos in the economy. No problem in the financial system. The reforms after the financial crisis put the financial system on very solid ground. But more importantly, I think the Fed wants higher inflation. I mean, I think it was ambivalent about higher inflation in the 2010s. They go, yeah, I'd like higher inflation, but 2% is my cap, and let's debate it. now there's no debate. The monetary policy framework has changed. We are going to see above target inflation. The Fed is going to keep the foot flat on the accelerator up in as we're coming into full employment. Inflation's above target. That's a difficult thing to navigate. Get there and then bring the plane right on the tarmac. 2% inflation. Life is good. It's going to be pretty hard to do. The second thing is debt loads are much, much higher. Governments are borrowing hand over fist everywhere on the planet. We've seen massive amounts of sovereign debt borrowing, not just the United States, every single economy on the planet. And that's not going to change anytime soon. Everyone's going to be stepped flat on the accelerator. And actually, there's a lot of corporate debt too, and not household debt here, but in the rest of the world. So leverage is rising pretty rapidly. In fact, one of the downsides of navigating through this pandemic the way we have is we have not addressed any of the underlying fundamental structural problems in the economy that typically get fixed in a recession, the creative destruction part of recession. That's not happening here. Leverage is actually higher coming out of this thing, not lower. And so I can go on and on, I can talk 5 days on this, but you get my drift. To me, the risk is not how low inflation interest rates will be in the future. It's going to be how high inflation interest rates are going to be. So I do think Concord Coalition is going to be much more relevant in the coming decade than you've always been relevant, but more relevant in the coming decade than in the past decade, because interest rates are going to be higher and you're going to be able to connect those dots for people. You can say, look, this is what's going on and it's going to cost us if we don't address it.